There's one bait in cold water that I believe catches more big bass than anything else, and that is a jig. And in today's video, I'm going to break down how to fish a jig and everything you need to know to fish a jig in cold water to help you catch more bass. Let's dive into this thing. That's a good one. Oh my gosh. It's like a 4-pounder. Sweet. Sparky jig. Hey dude, thanks for playing. Super thick. I went out on my first fishing trip of the year the other night, and the first bait that I picked up was a jig. And not only because I was looking for a big bite, but because this is a bait, a jig, that I really believe gets you more and bigger bites during those cold water periods. And in today's video, I really want to break down the intricacies of jig fishing, the gear you need, how to use it, and really what makes a jig successful in the springtime to help you catch more fish. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on trips, and to teach you about techniques like fishing a jig in cold water to help you catch more fish. So if you guys enjoy that style of content, consider subscribing to the channel and growing this community. Hit that thumbs up button and maybe share it with a friend that doesn't catch as many fish on a jig as you do. But without further ado, let's dive into this thing. Throughout this video, when I'm talking about a jig, what I'm talking about in this video is your standard casting style, arky style jig. This here is a custom poured jig, one that I pour at my house on a Do-It-Jig Sparky mold, but really any casting style jig with like an arky style head or sparky style head or just your standard casting style jigs is what I'm referring to throughout this video. But before we dive into the 4 tips that I want to talk about in this video, let's start by breaking down the gear that I use to fish this bait. When we start to talk about gear or rod setup for fishing a jig, I don't think you have to go anything too crazy. Really anything 7 foot to 7.6, medium heavy or heavy power is where you want to end up. But I'm going to talk about 2 different options. And the first one that I want to talk about is more of a up close and personal skip-in rod when I need to put that bait into really sneaky places. I like the 7-foot medium heavy TACTION series. The reason I like this rod is because it's a little bit shorter. I can get down low and skip that bait really effectively on a shorter rod, be a lot more precise, and it has a little bit more tip to the rod, which allows me to be more accurate when I'm casting that bait. So going with a little bit shorter rod, something that has a little bit of tip to it, is going to allow you to load that jig up and kind of skip that bait into those sneaky, hard to reach places. And the medium heavy power is really nice because you still have the leverage and the power to move that fish out of those areas of heavy cover, but it's not so heavy that a tip won't load up and you can't get a really precise cast. And the second setup that I use is a 7.6 heavy TACTION series. It's a moderate fast. The difference between the two is I'm going to use this if I'm flipping into these big laydowns and there's a potential a fish could wrap me around that laydown and I need to keep power on that fish. That's when I'm going to the 7.6. It also has a little bit longer length, so if I'm getting that bait away from me and I want to move that fish a lot more quickly, that little bit extra length can help me move that jig, move that fish, and the power will help me pull that fish out of there a little bit better than that shorter 7-foot medium heavy. So either one of these will be perfect for you, but you just want something where you have control over that bait and control over that fish when you do connect with them in that shallow cover. The other thing to know is I'm fishing a 7 speed gear ratio reel, 7 or 8 speed gear ratio, and 20-pound test fluorocarbon line. I'm fishing around some pretty big ones in heavy cover, and that 20-pound test, in my opinion, is really important, especially when you're putting it up on your docks, into laydowns, or areas where you need to have some abrasion resistance. Going to that 20-pound test fluorocarbon is really, really important. But as I alluded to earlier in the video, there are really 4 keys that I focus on when I'm fishing a jig. And the first, and in my opinion most important, is the rate of fall. What rate of fall means is how quickly your jig falls through the water column. This to me is the most important factor when you're jig fishing, whether you're flipping mats, whether you're fishing a swim jig and you need that bait to fall a little bit more slowly. Focusing on the rate of fall of your jig is critically important. Now, from what I've seen, there's really 2 main situations you're going to be faced with rate of fall. Either it matters a whole lot, how slowly that jig falls through, or it doesn't matter at all. That bait could rocket through the column, those fish are pinning it on bottom, and they want that bait dragged slowly out in front of their face. And especially up here in the springtime in Michigan, I do think rate of fall matters quite a bit. You want a bait that's going to fall a little bit more slowly, that's going to give those fish time in the area to locate that bait coming through the piece of cover down to the bottom. The reason I say this is because a lot of my bites during the springtime come as that bait's falling or as soon as it settles on the bottom. You may need to give it a couple hops or twitches, but I think having a bait that settles down slowly, looks really natural, and has a little bit slower rate of fall is going to trigger those fish to come over to it a lot more effectively than those baits that just rocket through. Where I do think those baits can rocket through really quick and it doesn't matter is when you're flipping grass mats or those fish are ultra aggressive and they don't really care what it is as long as it's getting in front of their face quickly. But in the springtime, I think rate of fall matters a whole heck of a lot. And in these next couple tips, I'm going to teach you how to affect the rate of fall that's going to also affect the amount of bites you get on your jig. And now that we've talked about rate of fall, the second thing we're going to talk about is the action of that jig. And a lot of people think that the trailer is the only way to impart action or get a different action out of a jig, but actually that skirt is the easiest and, in my opinion, the most effective way to change the action of your bait. And especially when you talk about cold water situations, a lot of people will talk about using a living rubber skirt, like I have in this video right here. The reason that I think a living rubber skirt is so effective in those colder water periods is that you get a bigger, bulkier profile that stands out in dirtier water. Living rubber, when it gets in water, will expand, flow out from that jig, and if there's natural current or movement on that jig, will have a natural pulsating action, as opposed to your standard silicone skirts, which when you fish that jig along bottom, those silicone skirts want to get tight to the body of that jig and they have less action in the water. So especially in cold water situations, a lot of people talk about fishing a living rubber jig. The thing with a living rubber jig too is it's going to impact your rate of fall. A living rubber skirt is going to slow down the rate of fall. A silicone skirt is going to fall a little bit more quickly. It's a bigger, bulkier profile, stands out away from the body of that jig. When it gets in the water, it's going to slow that bait down, as opposed to a silicone skirt, which is going to mat tight to that body and fall faster through the water column. Now, with all of that said about the skirt, you still have to talk about the trailer that you use. And this here is a Beast Coast Flippin' Delight. And there's really three main categories of trailers. This is a trailer that has a ton of action. When you flip this bait out there, it's going to kick really hard. It's going to have a big, wide, flapping action. And to be honest, this is not a jig trailer that I really like for cold water situations. Those flapping style trailers, like your Flippin' Delight, your Rage Craw, those really heavy flapping action trailers that move a lot of water are better for warm water situations, maybe closer towards the spawn into the summertime. That's when I'm going to pick up these flapping or really heavy action style trailers. The second style I want to talk about, and probably my favorite for cold water, is a Berkley Chigger Craw, or more of like a undulating swimming sort of profile through the water. It's sort of the in-between. It is the middle ground. It's a better cold water jig trailer that has a little bit less action, and when this bait's held still, it doesn't really move a lot of water. When you reel this bait in, it kind of maybe kicks and flutters a little bit, but it's not a big flapping action. It's also not a chunk style trailer, which has virtually zero action, and that's the third type of trailer, which is a chunk. I know guys that will swear by a chunk in cold water. It's basically just a dual tail trailer. I'll put a picture of it right here. A lot of guys swear by a chunk in cold water. It's just never something that I've had a banner day with. It's never something that seemed to make a massive difference going from a Chigger Craw style trailer to a chunk. And that's not to say going to a chunk won't make a difference. I'm sure there's a time and place for it, but I've been in situations where guys in the front of the boat are fishing a chunk, and I'm fishing a Chigger Craw, and I'm catching just as many, if not more fish than they are. One thing I want to mention really quick, and I'm actually filming this after finishing the video, is to talk to you guys about jig skirts. Now, I talk about making my own jigs. I talk about tying my own with living rubber. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of different companies out there where you can buy silicone skirted jigs. You can buy the silicone skirt to put on your jigs at home. But one thing Do It Molds actually just came out with are hybrid style jig skirts. If you guys looked really closely at the jigs that I was showing you guys, one thing you might notice is that they have flashaboo. The copper tinsel, the flash, whether it's, you know, the copper, the light blue, having flash in your jig is something that I do that I think helps me get extra bites. Do It came out with full banded skirts that are ready to go on your jigs if you want to add some flashaboo to your jigs. They also, and this is brand new, I don't know anyone else on the market that does this, has a living rubber silicone hybrid jig skirt. A lot of companies sell living rubber jigs. There's some really great living rubber jigs out there, but if you don't want to go out and make your own living rubber jigs, Do It has banded skirts with living rubber and silicone mixed in. Now, one of the hardest things about fishing living rubbers, you're really limited on colors. So you have like green, black, brown, purple, yellow, white. That's pretty much it for living rubber colors. But what Do It has done is they have hybrid models which has living rubber and silicone mixed together, so you can really cool colors with the living rubber jig skirt in there. But these are really cool options that will help you customize your jigs, go that little extra step when you get really into jig fishing and you want to do something a little bit different. Number 3 for me is the profile or size of that bait. For me, most of the time, I'm going to be throwing like this compact Sparky style jig. Compared to a lot of normal jigs on the market, this is a smaller presentation. It's like a 3 or 4/0 hook on there. It's a smaller, more compact presentation, more of a medium size jig. A lot of guys, especially during the springtime, you'll hear them talk about mop jigs, living rubber mop jigs, and some people may get so mad at me for talking about this, but a living rubber big mop jig during the springtime, especially as that water starts to come up into your 55 degree range, that mop style jig, especially with that really big living rubber skirt material, will create this giant profile underwater and look like those big bluegill. It's something that guys have used for a long time. Davey Height created the Buckeye mop jig, and it's been really a secret for a long time that's kind of been slept on. I know guys that throw it up here in the Midwest, especially when they're targeting big bluegill eaters, but in cold water, a big mop jig can be really, really effective. Now, conversely, even smaller than this compact flipping jig, you have really small finesse profile jigs like the Ike Mini Flip, and I believe that there's something when they get on those smaller bait, when they're on those young of the year crawdads, when things get really tough, they're pressured, they've seen some jigs, they've seen some baits flipped in their face later in the spring, going to a smaller presentation jig like this can get you more bites. And I know people are going to also talk about, your Beast Coast OW Sniper. This is specifically talking about, flipping or casting style jigs with a weed guard that you're putting into cover. The other thing about this mini flip is that it's going to fall a little bit more quickly. So as that water warms up, as this fish become more aggressive, going to, like a ½ ounce mini flip is going to fall faster than this living rubber jig. So again, paying attention to rate of fall. That mop jig is going to fall super slowly, undulate, fall on bottom. The living rubber is going to spread out, create a massive profile. This jig kind of fall at medium speed, all things remaining equal, and then your mini flip is going to fall relatively quickly, but create a smaller profile or presentation along the bottom. And my 4th and final thing that I'm going to take into consideration when I'm fishing a jig during the springtime is the presentation that I'm using. Now, my standard jig presentation when I pick up a jig and I'm going to a body of water for the first time is going to be to flip that jig into that piece of cover or into the area that I know that bass is at, let it sink all the way to the bottom on a semi-slack line. And the way I know if it's on bottom is when that line goes limp, when that line lays on the water, that jig has reached the bottom. I'll let it sit there, 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to just shake. Just kind of shake and hop that jig back to me. Fish it out of the area. And don't just wind it all the way back to the boat. Like wind it back to the boat at a relative steady pace like you would a swim jig, because you might even get bit on the swim, and that can teach you about how these fish are eating the bait. The second retrieve that I'm going to use is a dead stick presentation. Now this is really going to be when fish are lethargic, if the water got cold, or those fish are a little bit less active. When I say dead stick, I'm not meaning I'm going to shake it. I mean, I'm going to let that bait sit there. And this is where I really believe that living rubber jig skirt is really important. You let that bait sit there, that jig skirt flares out, your little chigger crawl in the back of there is not going to do a whole lot of anything, and that bait's just going to sit there in their face. That's where rate of fall is really, really important. The bait's going to come down, it's going to hit bottom, it's going to settle. If there's fish in that area, it's going to give them time to come over and look at it. And this is where you're going to get those pressure bites, where those fish will come up behind this bait and they're just going to mouth it and they're going to wait for you to pick up on it. And especially with a jig, this is really important to have good feel. This is why I like a sensitive higher end rod, because that pressure bite, you go to move that jig and it just doesn't feel kind of mushy. That's when you're going to set the hook. And I guess the other thing that I alluded to is pay attention to your line when you're fishing a jig this time of year. These fish, especially if there's other fish in the area, will get that jig as it's falling, and your line will just start swimming to the side. I actually caught a fish the other day that was pretty big. I flipped into this piece of wood, jig was falling, and jig just never kind of fell to the bottom. It's really important to know how deep that water is and what your line looks like when it hits the bottom. And my line was swimming to the side. That's how I knew I got that fish to bite. So those are my 4 main considerations when I'm fishing a jig, especially in the springtime. Rate of fall, which I believe is critically important. Anytime you're fishing a jig, the action that jig has, whether it's in the skirt material or the trailer you use, the size that jig is, and then the presentation or retrieve that you use. All of those things are going to be important when you're fishing a jig during the springtime to help you catch more fish. But if there's something that maybe I missed in this video, go down there and let me know down in the comment section down below. This is something that has been going phenomenally well over the past couple of videos, having full-blown conversations down in the comment section. So feel free to go down there and tell me something I missed, tell me something that caught you off guard or surprised you in this video, because I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comment section. I try to interact with as many of you guys as I possibly can. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button or hit my face right there. Or if you want to see a video where I talk about another bass fishing tip, click that video right there. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.